Section 15 of Germinal by Émile Zola, translated by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perrore. Part 3, Chapter 4. "Listen," said Maheude to her man, "when you go to Montsou for the pay, just bring me back a pound of coffee and a kilo of sugar." He was sewing one of his shoes, in order to spare the cobbling. "Good," he murmured, without leaving his task. "I should like you to go to the butcher's too. A bit of veal, eh? It's so long since we saw it." This time he raised his head. "Do you think, then, that I've got thousands coming in? The fortnight's pay is too little as it is, with their confounded idea of always stopping work." They were both silent. It was after breakfast, one Saturday, at the end of October. The Company, under the pretext of the derangement caused by payment, had on this day once more suspended output in all their pits. Seized by panic at the growing industrial crisis, and not wishing to augment their already considerable stock, they profited by the smallest pretext to force their 10,000 workers to rest. "You know that Étienne is waiting for you at Rasseneur's," began Maheude again. "Take him with you. He'll be more clever than you are in clearing up matters if they haven't counted all your hours." Maheu nodded approval. "And just talk to those gentlemen about your father's affair. The doctor's on good terms with the directors. It's true, isn't it, old un, that the doctor's mistaken, and that you can still work?" For 10 days Father Bonnemort, with benumbed paws, as he said, had remained nailed to his chair. She had to repeat her question, and he growled: "Sure enough, I can work. One isn't done for because one's legs are bad. All that is just stories they make up, so as not to give the 180 franc pension." Maheude thought of the old man's 40 sous, which he would, perhaps, never bring in any more, and she uttered a cry of anguish. "My God! We shall soon be all dead if this goes on." "When one is dead," said Maheu, "one doesn't get hungry." He put some nails into his shoes, and decided to set out. The 200 Quarants settlement would not be paid till towards 4 o'clock. The men did not hurry, therefore, but waited about, going off one by one, beset by the women, who implored them to come back at once. Many gave them commissions, to prevent them forgetting themselves in public houses. At Rasseneur, Étienne had received news. Disquieting rumours were flying about. It was said that the Company was more and more discontented over the timbering. They were overwhelming the workmen with fines, and a conflict appeared inevitable. That was, however, only the avowed dispute. Beneath it were grave and secret causes of complication. Just as Étienne arrived, a comrade, who was drinking a glass on his return from Montsou, was telling that an announcement had been stuck up at the cashier's, but he did not quite know what was on the announcement. A second entered, then a third, and each brought a different story. It seemed certain, however, that the Company had taken a resolution. "What do you say about it, eh?" asked Étienne, sitting down near Souvarine at a table where nothing was to be seen but a packet of tobacco. The engine man did not hurry, but finished rolling a cigarette. "I say that it was easy to foresee. They want to push you to extremes." He alone had a sufficiently keen intelligence to analyze the situation. He explained it in his quiet way. The Company, suffering from the crisis, had been forced to reduce their expenses if they were not to succumb, and it was naturally the workers who would have to tighten their bellies. Under some pretext or another the Company would nibble at their wages. For 2 months the coal had been remaining at the surface of their pits, and nearly all the workshops were resting. As the Company did not dare to rest in this way, terrified at the ruinous inaction, they were meditating a middle course, perhaps a strike, from which the miners would come out crushed and worse paid. Then the new Provident Fund was disturbing them, as it was a threat for the future, while a strike would relieve them of it by exhausting it when it was still small. Rasseneur had seated himself beside Étienne, and both of them were listening in consternation. They could talk aloud, because there was no one there but Madame Rasseneur, seated at the counter. "What an idea!" murmured the innkeeper. "What's the good of it? The Company has no interest in a strike, nor the men either. It would be best to come to an understanding." This was very sensible. He was always on the side of reasonable demands. Since the rapid popularity of his old lodger, he had even exaggerated the system of possible progress, saying they would obtain nothing if they wished to have everything at once. In his fat, good-humoured nature, nourished on beer, a secret jealousy was forming, increased by the desertion of his bar, into which the workmen from the Voreux now came more rarely to drink and to listen, and he thus sometimes even began to defend the Company, forgetting the rancour of an old miner who had been turned off. "Then you are against the strike?" cried Madame Rasseneur, without leaving the counter. And as he energetically replied "yes," she made him hold his tongue. "Bah! you have no courage. Let these gentlemen speak." Étienne was meditating, with his eyes fixed on the glass which she had served to him. At last he raised his head. "I dare say it's all true what our mate tells us, and we must get resigned to the strike if they force it on us. Pluchart has just written me some very sensible things on this matter. He's against the strike too, for the men would suffer as much as the masters, and it wouldn't come to anything decisive. Only it seems to him a capital chance to get our men to make up their minds to go into his big machine. Here's his letter." In fact, Pluchart, in despair at the suspicion which the International aroused among the miners at Montsou, was hoping to see them enter in a mass if they were forced to fight against the Company. In spite of his efforts, Étienne had not been able to place a single member's card, and he had given his best efforts to his Provident Fund, which was much better received. But this fund was still so small that it would be quickly exhausted, as Souvarine said, and the strikers would then inevitably throw themselves into the Working Men's Association, so that their brothers in every country could come to their aid. "How much have you in the fund?" asked Rasseneur. "Hardly 3,000 francs," replied Étienne. "And you know that the directors sent for me yesterday. Oh, they were very polite. They repeated that they wouldn't prevent their men from forming a reserve fund. But I quite understood that they wanted to control it. We are bound to have a struggle over that." The innkeeper was walking up and down, whistling contemptuously. 3,000 francs! What can you do with that? It wouldn't yield 6 days' bread. And if we counted on foreigners, such as the people in England, one might go to bed at once and turn up one's toes. No, it was too foolish, this strike. Then for the first time bitter words passed between these two men, who usually agreed together at last, in their common hatred of capital. "We shall see. And you, what do you say about it?" repeated Étienne, turning towards Souvarine. The latter replied with his usual phrase of habitual contempt: "A strike? Foolery!" Then, in the midst of the angry silence, he added gently: "On the whole, I shouldn't say no if it amuses you. It ruins the one side and kills the other, and that is always so much cleared away. Only in that way it will take quite 1,000 years to renew the world. Just begin by blowing up this prison in which you are all being done to death." With his delicate hand he pointed out the Voreux, the buildings of which could be seen through the open door. But an unforeseen drama interrupted him. Poland, the big tame rabbit which had ventured outside, came bounding back, fleeing from the stones of a band of trammers, and in her terror, with fallen ears and raised tail, she took refuge against his legs, scratching and imploring him to take her up. When he had placed her on his knees, he sheltered her with both hands, and fell into that kind of dreamy somnolence into which the caress of this soft warm fur always plunged him. Almost at the same time Maheu came in. He would drink nothing, in spite of the polite insistence of Madame Rasseneur, who sold her beer as though she made a present of it. Étienne had risen, and both of them set out for Montsou. On pay day at the Company's yards, Montsou seemed to be in the midst of a fête, as on fine Sunday feast days. Bands of miners arrived from all the settlements. The cashier's office being very small, they preferred to wait at the door, stationed in groups on the pavement, barring the way in a crowd that was constantly renewed. Hucksters profited by the occasion and installed themselves with their movable stalls that sold even pottery and cooked meats. But it was especially the estaminets and the bars which did a good trade, for the miners before being paid went to the counters to get patience, and returned to them to wet their pay as soon as they had it in their pockets. But they were very sensible, except when they finished it at the Volcan. As Maheu and Étienne advanced among the groups, they felt that on that day a deep exasperation was rising up. It was not the ordinary indifference with which the money was taken and spent at the publics. Fists were clenched and violent words were passing from mouth to mouth. "Is it true, then," asked Maheu of Chaval, whom he met before the Estaminet Piquette, "that they've played the dirty trick?" But Chaval contented himself by replying with a furious growl, throwing a sidelong look on Étienne. Since the working had been renewed, he had hired himself on with others, more and more bitten by envy against this comrade, the newcomer who posed as a boss and whose boots, as he said, were licked by the whole settlement. This was complicated by a lover's jealousy. He never took Catherine to Réquillart now, or behind the pit bank, without accusing her in abominable language of sleeping with her mother's lodger. Then, seized by a savage desire, he would stifle her with caresses. Maheu asked him another question. "Is it the Voreux' turn now?" And when he turned his back, after nodding affirmatively, both men decided to enter the yards. The counting house was a small rectangular room, divided in two by a grating. On the forms along the wall 5 or 6 miners were waiting, while the cashier assisted by a clerk was paying another, who stood before the wicket with his cap in his hand. Above the form, on the left, a yellow placard was stuck up, quite fresh against the smoky grey of the plaster, and it was in front of this that the men had been constantly passing all the morning. They entered 2 or 3 at a time, stood in front of it, and then went away without a word, shrugging their shoulders as if their backs were crushed. 2 colliers were just then standing in front of the announcement, a young one with a square brutish head and a very thin one, his face dull with age. Neither of them could read. The young one spelt, moving his lips; the old one contented himself with gazing stupidly. Many came in thus to look, without understanding. "Read us that there," said Maheu, who was not very strong either in reading, to his companion. Then Étienne began to read him the announcement. It was a notice from the Company to the miners of all the pits, informing them that in consequence of the lack of care bestowed on the timbering, and being weary of inflicting useless fines, the Company had resolved to apply a new method of payment for the extraction of coal. Henceforward they would pay for the timbering separately, by the cubic metre of wood taken down and used, based on the quantity necessary for good work. The price of the tub of coal extracted would naturally be lowered, in the proportion of 50 centimes to 40, according to the nature and distance of the cuttings, and a somewhat obscure calculation endeavoured to show that this diminution of 10 centimes would be exactly compensated by the price of the timbering. The Company added also that, wishing to leave every one time to convince himself of the advantages presented by this new scheme, they did not propose to apply it till Monday, the 1st of December. "Don't read so loud over there," shouted the cashier. "We can't hear what we are saying." Étienne finished reading without paying attention to this observation. His voice trembled, and when he had reached the end, they all continued to gaze steadily at the placard. The old miner and the young one looked as though they expected something more. Then they went away, with depressed shoulders. "Good God!" muttered Maheu. He and his companions sat down absorbed with lowered heads, and while files of men continued to pass before the yellow paper they made calculations. Were they being made fun of? They could never make up with the timbering for the 10 centimes taken off the tram. At most they could only get to 8 centimes, so the Company would be robbing them of 2 centimes, without counting the time taken by careful work. This, then, was what this disguised lowering of wages really came to. The Company was economizing out of the miners' pockets. "Good Lord! Good Lord!" repeated Maheu, raising his head. "We should be bloody fools if we took that." But the wicket being free, he went up to be paid. The heads only of the workings presented themselves at the desk, and then divided the money between their men to save time. "Maheu and Associates," said the clerk. "Filonniére seam, cutting number 7." He searched through the lists, which were prepared from the inspection of the tickets on which the captain stated every day for each stall the number of trams extracted. Then he repeated: "Maheu and Associates, Filonniére seam, cutting number 7, 135 francs." The cashier paid. "Beg pardon, sir," stammered the pikeman in surprise. "Are you sure you have not made a mistake?" He looked at the small sum of money without picking it up, frozen by a shudder which went to his heart. It was true he was expecting bad payment, but it could not come to so little or he must have calculated wrong. When he had given their shares to Zacharie, Étienne, and the other mate who replaced Chaval, there would remain at most 50 francs for himself, his father, Catherine, and Jeanlin. "No, no, I've made no mistake," replied the clerk. "There are 2 Sundays and 4 rest days to be taken off. That makes 9 days of work." Maheu followed this calculation in a low voice. 9 days gave him about 30 francs, 18 to Catherine, 9 to Jeanlin. As to Father Bonnemort, he only had 3 days. No matter, by adding the 90 francs of Zacharie and the 2 mates, that would surely make more. "And don't forget the fines," added the clerk. 20 francs for fines for defective timbering. The pikeman made a gesture of despair. 20 francs of fines, 4 days of rest, that made out the account. To think that he had once brought back a fortnight's pay of full 150 francs when Father Bonnemort was working and Zacharie had not yet set up house for himself. "Well, are you going to take it?" cried the cashier impatiently. "You can see there's someone else waiting. If you don't want it, say so." As Maheude decided to pick up the money with his large trembling hand, the clerk stopped him. "Wait, I have your name here. Toussaint Maheu, is it not? The general secretary wishes to speak to you. Go in, he is alone." The dazed workman found himself in an office furnished with old mahogany, upholstered with faded green rep. As he listened for 5 minutes to the general secretary, a tall, sallow gentleman, who spoke to him over the papers of his bureau without rising, but the buzzing in his ears prevented him from hearing, he understood vaguely that the question of his father's retirement would be taken into consideration with a pension of 150 francs, 50 years of age and 40 years of service. Then it seemed to him that the secretary's voice became harder. There was a reprimand, he was accused of occupying himself with politics, an allusion was made to his lodger and the Provident Fund. Finally, he was advised not to compromise himself with these follies, he who was one of the best workmen in the mine. He wished to protest, but could only pronounce words at random, twisting his cap between his feverish fingers, and he retired, stuttering: "Certainly, sir, I can assure you, sir." Outside, when he had found Étienne, who was waiting for him, he broke out: "Well, I am a bloody fool. I ought to have replied. Not enough money to get bread, and insults as well. Yes, he has been talking against you. He told me the settlement was being poisoned. And what's to be done? Good God! Bend one's back and say thank you? He's right, that's the wisest plan." Maheu fell silent, overcome at once by rage and fear. Étienne was gloomily thinking. Once more they traversed the groups who blocked the road. The exasperation was growing, the exasperation of a calm race, the muttered warning of a storm, without violent gestures, terrible to see above this solid mass. A few men understanding accounts had made calculations, and the 2 centimes gained by the Company over the wood were rumoured about and excited the hardest heads. But it was especially the rage over this disastrous pay, the rebellion of the hunger against the rest days and the fines. Already there was not enough to eat, and what would happen if wages were still further lowered? In the estaminets the anger grew loud, and fury so dried their throats that the little money taken went over the counters. From Montsou to the settlement, Étienne and Maheu never exchanged a word. When the latter entered, Maheude, who was alone with the children, noticed immediately that his hands were empty. "Well, you're a nice one," she said. "Where's my coffee and my sugar and the meat? A bit of veal wouldn't have ruined you." He made no reply, stifled by the emotion he had been keeping back. Then the coarse face of this man, hardened to work in the mines, became swollen with despair, and large tears broke from his eyes and fell in a warm rain. He had thrown himself into a chair, weeping like a child, and throwing 50 francs on the table. "Here," he stammered, "that's what I've brought you back. That's our work for all of us." Maheude looked at Étienne and saw that he was silent and overwhelmed. Then she also wept. How were 9 people to live for a fortnight on 50 francs? Her eldest son had left them, the old man could no longer move his legs, it would soon mean death. Alzire threw herself round her mother's neck, overcome on hearing her weep. Estelle was howling, Lénore and Henri were sobbing. And from the entire settlement there soon arose the same cry of wretchedness. The men had come back, and each household was lamenting the disaster of this bad pay. The doors opened, women appeared, crying aloud outside, as if their complaints could not be held beneath the ceilings of these small houses. A fine rain was falling, but they did not feel it. They called one another from the pavements, they showed one another in the hollow of their hands the money they had received. "Look, they've given him this. Do they want to make fools of people? As for me, see, I haven't got enough to pay for the fortnight's bread with. And just count mine, I should have to sell my shifts." Maheude had come out like the others. A group had formed around the Levaque woman, who was shouting loudest of all, for her drunkard of a husband had not even turned up, and she knew that, large or small, the pay would melt away at the Volcan. Philoméne watched Maheu so that Zacharie should not get hold of the money. Pierron was the only one who seemed fairly calm, for that sneak of a Pierron always arranged things, no one knew how, so as to have more hours on the captain's ticket than his mates. But Mother Brulé thought this cowardly of her son-in-law. She was among the enraged, lean and erect in the midst of the group, with her fists stretched towards Montsou. "To think," she cried, without naming the Hennebeaus, "that this morning I saw their servant go by in a carriage. Yes, the cook in a carriage with 2 horses, going to Marchiennes to get fish, sure enough." A clamour arose, and the abuse began again. That servant in a white apron taken to the market of the neighbouring town in her master's carriage aroused indignation. While the workers were dying of hunger, they must have their fish at all costs. Perhaps they would not always be able to eat their fish. The turn of the poor people would come. And the ideas sown by Étienne sprang up and expanded in this cry of revolt. It was impatience before the promised age of gold, a haste to get a share of the happiness beyond this horizon of misery closed in like the grave. The injustice was becoming too great; at last they would demand their rights, since the bread was being taken out of their mouths. The women especially would have liked at once to take by assault this ideal city of progress, in which there was to be no more wretchedness. It was almost night, and the rain increased while they were still filling the settlement with their tears, in the midst of the screaming helter-skelter of the children. That evening, at the Avantage, the strike was decided on. Rasseneur no longer struggled against it, and Souvarine accepted it as a first step. Étienne summed up the situation in a word: if the Company really wanted to strike, then the Company should have a strike. Section 15. Section 16 of Germinal by Émile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Garrard. Part 3. Chapter 5. A week passed and work went on suspiciously and mournfully in expectation of the conflict. Among the Maheus, the fortnight threatened to be more meagre than ever. Maheude grew bitter, in spite of her moderation and good sense. Her daughter, Catherine, too, had taken it into her head to stay out one night. On the following morning she came back so weary and ill after this adventure that she was not able to go to the pit, and she told with tears how it was not her fault, for Chaval had kept her, threatening to beat her if she ran away. He was becoming mad with jealousy and wished to prevent her from returning to Étienne's bed, where he well knew, he said, that the family made her sleep. Maheude was furious, and after forbidding her daughter ever to see such a brute again, talked of going to Montsou to box his ears. But all the same, it was a day lost, and the girl, now that she had this lover, preferred not to change him. 2 days after, there was another incident. On Monday and Tuesday, Jeanlin, who was supposed to be quietly engaged on his task at the Voreux, had escaped, to run away into the marshes and the forest of Vandame with Bébert and Lydie. He had seduced them. No one knew to what plunder or to what games of precocious children they had all three given themselves up. He received a vigorous punishment, a whipping which his mother applied to him on the pavement outside, before the terrified children of the settlement. Who could have thought such a thing of children belonging to her, who had cost so much since their birth, and who ought now to be bringing something in? And in this cry there was the remembrance of her own hard youth, of the hereditary misery which made of each little one in the brood a breadwinner later on. That morning, when the men and the girl set out for the pit, Maheude sat up in her bed to say to Jeanlin: "You know that if you begin that game again, you little beast, I'll take the skin off your bottom." In Maheude's new stall the work was hard. This part of the filonnière seam was so thin that the pikemen, squeezed between the wall and the roof, grazed their elbows at their work. It was, too, becoming very damp. From hour to hour they feared a rush of water, one of those sudden torrents which burst through rocks and carry away men. The day before, as Étienne was violently driving in his pick and drawing it out, he had received a jet of water in his face. But this was only an alarm. The cutting simply became damper and more unwholesome. Besides, he now thought nothing of possible accidents. He forgot himself there with his mates, careless of peril. They lived in fire damp without even feeling its weight on their eyelids, the spider's web veil which it left on the eyelashes. Sometimes, when the flame of the lamps grew paler and bluer than usual, it attracted attention, and a miner would put his head against the seam to listen to the low noise of the gas, a noise of air bubbles escaping from each crack. But the constant threat was of landslips, for, besides the insufficiency of the timbering, always patched up too quickly, the soil, soaked with water, would not hold. 3 times during the day Maheu had been obliged to add to the planking. It was 2:30, and the men would soon have to ascend. Lying on his side, Étienne was finishing the cutting of a block, when a distant growl of thunder shook the whole mine. "What's that, then?" he cried, putting down his axe to listen. He had at first thought that the gallery was falling in behind his back. But Maheu had already glided along the slope of the cutting, saying: "It's a fall! Quick! Quick!" All tumbled down and hastened, carried away by an impulse of anxious fraternity. Their lamps danced at their wrists in the deathly silence which had fallen. They rushed in single file along the passages with bent backs, as though they were galloping on all fours. And without slowing this gallop, they asked each other questions and threw brief replies. Where was it then? In the cuttings, perhaps. No, it came from below. No, from the haulage. When they arrived at the chimney passage, they threw themselves into it, tumbling one over the other without troubling about bruises. Jeanlin, with skin still red from the whipping of the day before, had not run away from the pit on this day. He was trotting with naked feet behind his tram, closing the ventilation doors one by one. When he was not afraid of meeting a captain, he jumped on to the last tram, which he was not allowed to do for fear he should go to sleep. But his great amusement was, whenever the tram was shunted, to let another one pass, to go and join Bébert, who was holding the reins in front. He would come up slyly without his lamp and vigorously pinch his companion, inventing mischievous monkey tricks, with his yellow hair, his large ears, his lean muzzle, lit up by little green eyes shining in the darkness. With morbid precocity, he seemed to have the obscure intelligence and the quick skill of a human abortion which had returned to its animal ways. In the afternoon Mouque brought Bataille, whose turn it was, to the trammers, and as the horse was snuffing in the shunting, Jeanlin, who had glided up to Bébert, asked him: "What's the matter with the old hack, to stop short like that? He'll break my legs." Bébert could not reply. He had to hold in Bataille, who was growing lively at the approach of the other tram. The horse had smelled from afar his comrade, Trompette, for whom he had felt great tenderness ever since the day when he had seen him disembarked in the pit. One might say that it was the affectionate pity of an old philosopher anxious to console a young friend by imparting to him his own resignation and patience. For Trompette did not become reconciled, drawing his trams without any taste for the work, standing with lowered head blinded by the darkness, and forever regretting the sun. So every time that Bataille met him, he put out his head, snorting, and moistened him with an encouraging caress. "By God!" swore Bébert, "there they are, licking each other's skins again." Then, when Trompette had passed, he replied, on the subject of Bataille: "Oh, he's a cunning old beast. When he stops like that, it's because he guesses there's something in the way, a stone or a hole, and he takes care of himself, he doesn't want to break his bones. To day, I don't know what was the matter with him down there, after the door. He pushed it and stood stock still. Did you see anything?" "No," said Jeanlin. "There's water. I've got it up to my knees." The tram set out again, and on the following journey, when he had opened the ventilation door with a blow from his head, Bataille again refused to advance, neighing and trembling. At last he made up his mind, and set off with a bound. Jeanlin, who closed the door, had remained behind. He bent down and looked at the mud through which he was paddling. Then, raising his lamp, he saw that the wood had given way beneath the continual bleeding of a spring. Just then a pikeman, one Berloque, who was called Chicot, had arrived from his cutting, in a hurry to go to his wife who had just been confined. He also stopped and examined the planking. And suddenly, as the boy was starting to rejoin his train, a tremendous cracking sound was heard, and a landslip engulfed the man and the child. There was deep silence. A thick dust raised by the wind of the fall passed through the passages. Blinded and choked, the miners came from every part, even from the farthest stalls, with their dancing lamps which feebly lighted up this gallop of black men at the bottom of these molehills. When the first men tumbled against the landslip, they shouted out and called their mates. A second band, come from the cutting below, found themselves on the other side of the mass of earth which stopped up the gallery. It was at once seen that the roof had fallen in for a dozen metres at most. The damage was not serious, but all hearts were contracted when a death rattle was heard from the ruins. Bébert, leaving his tram, ran up, repeating: "Jeanlin is underneath! Jeanlin is underneath!" Maheu, at this very moment, had come out of the passage with Zacharie and Étienne. He was seized with a fury of despair, and could only utter oaths: "My God! My God! My God!" Catherine, Lydie, and Mouquette, who had also rushed up, began to sob and shriek with terror in the midst of the fearful disorder, which was increased by the darkness. The men tried to make them be silent, but they shrieked louder as each groan was heard. The captain, Richomme, had come up running, in despair that neither Négrel, the engineer, nor Dansaert was at the pit. With his ear pressed against the rocks he listened, and at last said those sounds could not come from a child. A man must certainly be there. Maheu had already called Jeanlin 20 times over. Not a breath was heard. The little one must have been smashed up. And still the groans continued monotonously. They spoke to the agonized man, asking him his name. The groaning alone replied. "Look sharp," repeated Richomme, who had already organized a rescue. "We can talk afterwards." From each end the miners attacked the landslip with pick and shovel. Chaval worked without a word beside Maheu and Étienne, while Zacharie superintended the removal of the earth. The hour for ascent had come, and no one had touched food, but they could not go up for their soup while their mates were in peril. They realized, however, that the settlement would be disturbed if no one came back, and it was proposed to send off the women. But neither Catherine nor Mouquette, nor even Lydie, would move, nailed to the spot with the desire to know what had happened and to help. Levaque then accepted the commission of announcing the landslip up above, a simple accident which was being repaired. It was nearly 4 o'clock. In less than an hour the men had done a day's work. Half the earth would have already been removed if more rocks had not slid from the roof. Maheu persisted with such energy that he refused, with a furious gesture, when another man approached to relieve him for a moment. "Gently," said Richomme at last. "We are getting near. We must not finish them off." In fact, the groaning was becoming more and more distinct. It was a continuous rattling which guided the workers, and now it seemed to be beneath their very picks. Suddenly it stopped. In silence they all looked at one another and shuddered, as they felt the coldness of death pass in the darkness. They dug on, soaked in sweat, their muscles tense to breaking. They came upon a foot, and then began to remove the earth with their hands, freeing the limbs one by one. The head was not hurt. They turned their lamps on it, and Chicot's neck went round. He was quite warm, with his spinal column broken by a rock. "Wrap him up in a covering and put him in a tram," ordered the captain. "Now for the lad. Look sharp." Maheu gave a last blow, and an opening was made, communicating with the men who were clearing away the soil from the other side. They shouted out that they had just found Jeanlin, unconscious, with both legs broken, still breathing. It was the father who took up the little one in his arms, with clenched jaws constantly uttering "My God!" to express his grief, while Catherine and the other women again began to shriek. A procession was quickly formed. Bébert had brought back Bataille, who was harnessed to the trams. In the first lay Chicot's corpse, supported by Étienne. In the second, Maheu was seated with Jeanlin, still unconscious, on his knees, covered by a strip of wool torn from the ventilation door. They started at a walking pace. On each tram was a lamp like a red star. Then behind followed the row of miners, some 50 shadows in single file. Now that they were overcome by fatigue, they trailed their feet, slipping in the mud, with the mournful melancholy of a flock stricken by an epidemic. It took them nearly half an hour to reach the pit eye. This procession beneath the earth, in the midst of deep darkness, seemed never to end through galleries which bifurcated and turned and unrolled. At the pit eye, Richomme, who had gone on before, had ordered an empty cage to be reserved. Pierron immediately loaded the 2 trams. In the first Maheu remained with his wounded little one on his knees, while in the other Étienne kept Chicot's corpse between his arms to hold it up. When the men had piled themselves up in the other decks, the cage rose. It took 2 minutes. The rain from the tubbing fell very cold, and the men looked up towards the air impatient to see daylight. Fortunately, a trammer sent to Dr. Vanderhaghen's had found him and brought him back. Jeanlin and the dead man were placed in the captain's room, where from year's end to year's end a large fire burnt. A row of buckets with warm water was ready for washing feet, and two mattresses having been spread on the floor, the man and the child were placed on them. Maheu and Étienne alone entered. Outside, putters, miners, and boys were running about, forming groups and talking in a low voice. As soon as the doctor had glanced at Chicot, "Done for, you can wash him." Two overseers undressed him, and then washed with a sponge this corpse blackened with coal and still dirty with the sweat of work. "Nothing wrong with the head," said the doctor again, kneeling on Jeanlin's mattress, "nor the chest either. Ah, it's the legs which have given." He himself undressed the child, unfastening the cap, taking off the jacket, drawing off the breeches and shirt with the skill of a nurse. And the poor little body appeared, as lean as an insect, stained with black dust and yellow earth, marbled by bloody patches. Nothing could be made out, and they had to wash him also. He seemed to grow leaner beneath the sponge, the flesh so pallid and transparent that one could see the bones. It was a pity to look on this last degeneration of a wretched race, this mere nothing that was suffering and half crushed by the falling of the rocks. When he was clean they perceived the bruises on the thighs, two red patches on the white skin. Jeanlin, awaking from his faint, moaned. Standing up at the foot of the mattress with hands hanging down, Maheu was looking at him, and large tears rolled from his eyes. "Eh, are you the father?" said the doctor, raising his head. "No need to cry then, you can see he's not dead. Help me instead." He found two simple fractures, but the right leg gave him some anxiety. It would probably have to be cut off. At this moment the engineer, Négrel, and Dansaert, who had been informed, came up with Richomme. The first listened to the captain's narrative with an exasperated air. He broke out: "Always this cursed timbering! Had he not repeated 100 times that they would leave their men down there? And those brutes who talked about going out on strike if they were forced to timber more solidly. The worst was that now the Company would have to pay for the broken pots. Monsieur Hennebeau would be pleased." "Who is it?" he asked of Dansaert, who was standing in silence before the corpse, which was being wrapped up in a sheet. "Chicot, one of our good workers," replied the chief captain. "He has 3 children, poor chap." Dr. Vanderhaghen ordered Jeanlin's immediate removal to his parents'. 6 o'clock struck. Twilight was already coming on, and they would do well to remove the corpse also. The engineer gave orders to harness the van and to bring a stretcher. The wounded child was placed on the stretcher while the mattress and the dead body were put into the van. Some putters were still standing at the door talking with some miners who were waiting about to look on. When the door reopened there was silence in the group. A new procession was then formed, the van in front, then the stretcher, and then the train of people. They left the mine square and went slowly up the road to the settlement. The first November cold had denuded the immense plain; the night was now slowly bearing it like a shroud fallen from the livid sky. Étienne then, in a low voice, advised Maheude to send Catherine on to warn Maheude so as to soften the blow. The overwhelmed father, who was following the stretcher, agreed with a nod, and the young girl set out, running, for they were now near. But the van, that gloomy, well-known box, was already signalled. Women ran out wildly onto the paths. 3 or 4 rushed about in anguish, without their bonnets. Soon there were 30 of them, then 50, all choking with the same terror. Then someone was dead? Who was it? The story told by Levaque after first reassuring them, now exaggerated their nightmare. It was not one man, it was 10 who had perished, and who were now being brought back in the van one by one. Catherine found her mother agitated by a presentiment, and after hearing the first stammered words, Maheude cried: "The father's dead!" The young girl protested in vain, speaking of Jeanlin. Without hearing her, Maheude had rushed forward, and on seeing the van, which was passing before the church, she grew faint and pale. The women at their doors, mute with terror, were stretching out their necks, while others followed, trembling, as they wondered before whose house the procession would stop. The vehicle passed, and behind it Maheude saw Maheu, who was accompanying the stretcher. Then, when they had placed the stretcher at her door, and when she saw Jeanlin alive with his legs broken, there was so sudden a reaction in her that she choked with anger, stammering without tears: "Is this it? They cripple our little ones now? Both legs! My God! What do they want me to do with him?" "Be still, then," said Dr. Vanderhaghen, who had followed to attend to Jeanlin. "Would you rather he had remained below?" But Maheude grew more furious, while Alzire, Lénore, and Henri were crying round her. As she helped to carry up the wounded boy and to give the doctor what he needed, she cursed fate, and asked where she was to find money to feed invalids. The old man was not thin enough; now this rascal too had lost his legs. And she never ceased, while other cries, more heartbreaking lamentations, were heard from a neighbouring house. Chicot's wife and children were weeping over the body. It was now quite night, the exhausted miners were at last eating their soup, and the settlement had fallen into a melancholy silence, only disturbed by these loud outcries. 3 weeks passed. It was found possible to avoid amputation. Jeanlin kept both his legs, but he remained lame. On investigation, the Company had resigned itself to giving a donation of 50 francs. It had also promised to find employment for the little cripple at the service as soon as he was well. All the same, their misery was aggravated, for the father had received such a shock that he was seriously ill with fever. Since Thursday, Maheu had been back at the pit, and it was now Sunday. In the evening, Étienne talked of the approaching date of the 1st of December, preoccupied in wondering if the Company would execute its threat. They sat up till 10 o'clock, waiting for Catherine, who must have been delaying with Chaval, but she did not return. Maheude furiously bolted the door without a word. Étienne was long in going to sleep, restless at the thought of that empty bed in which Alzire occupied so little room. Next morning she was still absent, and it was only in the afternoon, on returning from the pit, that the Maheus learnt that Chaval was keeping Catherine. He created such abominable scenes with her that she had decided to stay with him. To avoid reproaches he had suddenly left the Voreux, and had taken on at Jean Bart, M. Deneulin's mine, and she had followed him as a putter. The new household still lived at Montsou at Piquette's. Maheu at first talked of going to fight the man and of bringing his daughter back with a kick in the backside. Then he made a gesture of resignation. What was the good? It always turned out like that. One could not prevent a girl from sticking to a man when she wanted to. It was much better to wait quietly for the marriage. But Maheu did not take things so easily. "Did I beat her when she took this Chaval?" she cried to Étienne, who listened in silence, very pale. "See now, tell me, you who are a sensible man, we have left her free, haven't we? Because, my God, they all come to it. Now, I was in the family way when the father married me, but I didn't run away from my parents, and I should never have done so dirty a trick as to carry the money I earned to a man who had no want of it before the proper age. Ah, it's disgusting, you know. People will leave off getting children." And as Étienne still replied only by nodding his head, she insisted: "A girl who went out every evening where she wanted to, what has she got in her skin, then, not to be able to wait till I married her after she had helped to get us out of difficulties, eh? It's natural, one has a daughter to work. But there, we have been too good, we ought not to let her go and amuse herself with a man. Give them an inch and they take an ell." Alzire nodded approvingly, and Lénore and Henri, overcome by this storm, cried quietly, while the mother now enumerated their misfortunes. First Zacharie, who had had to get married, then old Bonnemort, who was there on his chair with his twisted feet. Then Jeanlin, who could not leave the room for 10 days with his badly united bones. And now, as a last blow, this jade Catherine, who had gone away with a man. The whole family was breaking up. There was only the father left at the pit. How were they to live, 7 persons without counting Estelle, on his 3 francs? They might as well jump into the canal in a band. "It won't do any good to worry yourself," said Maheu in a low voice. "Perhaps we have not got to the end." Étienne, who was looking fixedly at the flags on the floor, raised his head and murmured with eyes lost in a vision of the future: "Ah, it is time! It is time!" Section 17 of Germinal by Émile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Part 4. Chapter 1. On that Monday, the Hennebeaus had invited the Grégoires and their daughter Cécile to lunch. They had formed their plans. On rising from table, Paul Négrel was to take the ladies to a mine, Saint Thomas, which had been luxuriously reinstalled. But this was only an amiable pretext. This party was an invention of Madame Hennebeau's to hasten the marriage of Cécile and Paul. Suddenly, on this very Monday, at 4 o'clock in the morning, the strike broke out. When, on the 1st of December, the Company had adopted the new wage system, the miners remained calm. At the end of the fortnight, not one made the least protest on pay day. Everybody, from the manager down to the last overseer, considered the tariff as accepted, and great was their surprise in the morning at this declaration of war, made with a tactical unity which seemed to indicate energetic leadership. At 5 o'clock, Dansaert woke M. Hennebeau to inform him that not a single man had gone down at the Voreux. The settlement of the Deux Cent Quarante, which he had passed through, was sleeping deeply, with closed windows and doors. And as soon as the manager had jumped out of bed, his eyes still swollen with sleep, he was overwhelmed. Every quarter of an hour messengers came in, and dispatches fell on his desk as thick as hail. At first he hoped that the revolt was limited to the Voreux, but the news became more serious every minute. There was the Mirou, the Crèvecoeur, the Madeleine, where only the grooms had appeared, the Victoire and Feutry Cantel, the 2 best disciplined pits, where the men had been reduced by a third. Saint Thomas alone numbered all its people, and seemed to be outside the movement. Up to 9 o'clock he dictated dispatches, telegraphing in all directions, to the prefect of Lille, to the directors of the Company, warning the authorities and asking for orders. He had sent Négrel to go round the neighbouring pits to obtain precise information. Suddenly M. Hennebeau recollected the lunch, and he was about to send the coachman to tell the Grégoires that the party had been put off, when a certain hesitation and lack of will stopped him. The man who in a few brief phrases had just made military preparations for a field of battle. He went up to Madame Hennebeau, whose hair had just been done by her lady's maid, in her dressing room. "Ah, they are on strike," she said quietly, when he had told her. "Well, what has that to do with us? We are not going to leave off eating, I suppose?" And she was obstinate. It was vain to tell her that the lunch would be disturbed, and that the visit to Saint Thomas could not take place. She found an answer to everything. Why lose a lunch that was already cooking? And as to visiting the pit, they could give that up afterwards if the walk was really imprudent. "Besides," she added, when the maid had gone out, "you know that I am anxious to receive these good people. This marriage ought to affect you more than the follies of your men. I want to have it. Don't contradict me." He looked at her, agitated by a slight trembling, and the hard, firm face of the man of discipline expressed the secret grief of a wounded heart. She had remained with naked shoulders, already over mature, but still imposing and desirable. with the broad bust of a Ceres gilded by the autumn. For a moment he felt a brutal desire to seize her, and to roll his head between the breasts she was exposing in this warm room, which exhibited the private luxury of a sensual woman and had about it an irritating perfume of musk. But he recoiled. For 10 years they had occupied separate rooms. "Good," he said, leaving her. "Do not make any alterations." M. Hennebeau had been born in the Ardennes. In his early life he had undergone the hardships of a poor boy thrown as an orphan on the Paris streets. After having painfully followed the courses of the École des Mines, at the age of 24 he had gone to the Grand Combe as engineer to the Sainte Barbe mine. 3 years later he became divisional engineer of the Pas de Calais at the Marle mines. It was there that he married, wedding, by one of those strokes of fortune which are the rule among the Corps des Mines, the daughter of the rich owner of a spinning factory at Arras. For 15 years they lived in the same small provincial town, and no event broke the monotony of existence, not even the birth of a child. An increasing irritation detached Madame Hennebeau, who had been brought up to respect money, and was disdainful of this husband who gained a small salary with such difficulty, and who enabled her to gratify none of the satisfactions of vanity which she had dreamed of at school. He was a man of strict honesty, who never speculated, but stood at his post like a soldier. The lack of harmony had only increased, aggravated by one of those curious misunderstandings of the flesh which freezes the most ardent. He adored his wife. She had the sensuality of a greedy blonde, and already they slept apart, ill at ease and wounded. From that time she had a lover of whom he was ignorant. At last he left the Pas de Calais to occupy a situation in an office at Paris, with the idea that she would be grateful to him. But Paris only completed their separation, that Paris which she had desired since her first doll, and where she washed away her provincialism in a week, becoming a woman of fashion at once and throwing herself into all the luxurious follies of the period. The 10 years which she spent there were filled by a great passion, a public intrigue with a man whose desertion nearly killed her. This time the husband had not been able to keep his ignorance, and after some abominable scenes he resigned himself, disarmed by the quiet unconscious of this woman who took her happiness where she found it. It was after the rupture, and when he saw that she was ill with grief, that he had accepted the management of the Montsou mines, still hoping also that she would reform down there in that desolate black country. The Hennebeaus, since they had lived at Montsou, returned to the irritated boredom of their early married days. At first she seemed consoled by the great quiet, soothed by the flat monotony of the immense plain. She buried herself in it as a woman who has done with the world. She affected a dead heart, so detached from life that she did not even mind growing stout. Then, beneath this indifference, a final fever declared itself, the need to live once more, and she deluded herself for 6 months by organizing and furnishing to her taste the little villa belonging to the management. She said it was frightful, and filled it with upholstery, bric-à-brac, and all sorts of artistic luxuries, which were talked of as far as Lille. Now the country exasperated her. Those stupid fields spread out to infinity, those eternal black roads without a tree, swarming with a horrid population, which disgusted and frightened her. Complaints of exile began. She accused her husband of having sacrificed her to a salary of 40,000 francs, a trifle which hardly sufficed to keep the house up. Why could he not imitate others, demand a part for himself, obtain shares, succeed in something at last? And she insisted with the cruelty of an heiress who had brought her own fortune. He, always restrained, and taking refuge in the deceptive coldness of a man of business, was torn by desire for this creature, one of those late desires which are so violent and which increase with age. He had never possessed her as a lover. He was haunted by a continual image. To have her once to himself as she had given herself to another. Every morning he dreamed of winning her in the evening. Then, when she looked at him with her cold eyes, and when he felt that everything within her denied itself to him, he avoided touching her hand. It was a suffering without possible cure, hidden beneath the stiffness of his attitude, the suffering of a tender nature in secret anguish at the lack of domestic happiness. At the end of 6 months, when the house being definitely furnished no longer occupied Madame Hennebeau, she fell into the languor of boredom, a victim who was being killed by exile, and who said that she was glad to die of it. Just then Paul Négrel arrived at Montsou. His mother, the widow of a Provence captain living at Avignon on a slender income, had had to content herself with bread and water to enable him to reach the École Polytechnique. He had come out low in rank, and his uncle, M. Hennebeau, had enabled him to leave by offering to take him as engineer at the Voreux. From that time he was treated as one of the family. He even had his room there, his meals there, lived there, and was thus enabled to send to his mother half his salary of 3,000 francs. To disguise this kindness, M. Hennebeau spoke of the embarrassment to a young man of setting up a household in one of those little villas reserved for the mine engineers. Madame Hennebeau had at once taken the part of a good aunt, treating her nephew with familiarity and watching over his comfort. During the first months, especially, she exhibited an overwhelming maternity with her advice regarding the smallest subjects. But she remained a woman, however, and slid into personal confidences. This lad, so young and so practical, with his unscrupulous intelligence, professing a philosopher's theory of love, amused her with the vivacity of the pessimism which had sharpened his thin face and pointed nose. One evening he naturally found himself in her arms, and she seemed to give herself up out of kindness, while saying to him that she had no heart left, and wished only to be his friend. In fact, she was not jealous. She joked him about the putters, whom he declared to be abominable, and she almost sulked because he had no young man's pranks to narrate to her. Then she was carried away by the idea of getting him married. She dreamed of sacrificing herself and of finding a rich girl for him. Their relations continued a plaything, a recreation, in which she felt the last tenderness of a lazy woman who had done with the world. 2 years had passed by. One night M. Hennebeau had a suspicion when he heard naked feet passing his door. But this new adventure revolted him. In his own house, between this mother and this son! And besides, on the following day his wife spoke to him about the choice of Cécile Grégoire, which she had made for her nephew. She occupied herself over this marriage with such ardour that he blushed at his own monstrous imagination. He only felt gratitude towards the young man who, since his arrival, had made the house less melancholy. As he came down from the dressing room, M. Hennebeau found that Paul, who had just returned, was in the vestibule. He seemed to be quite amused by the story of this strike. "Well?" asked his uncle. "Well, I've been round the settlements. They seem to be quite sensible in there. I think they will first send you a deputation." But at that moment Madame Hennebeau's voice called from the first story: "Is that you, Paul? Come up then, and tell me the news. How queer they are to make such a fuss, these people who are so happy." And the manager had to renounce further information, since his wife had taken his messenger. He returned and sat before his desk, on which a new packet of dispatches was placed. At 11 o'clock the Grégoires arrived, and were astonished when Hippolyte, the footman, who was placed as sentinel, hustled them in after an anxious glance at the two ends of the road. The drawing room curtains were drawn, and they were taken at once into the study, where M. Hennebeau apologized for their reception. But the drawing room looked over the street, and it was undesirable to seem to offer provocations. "What! You don't know?" he went on, seeing their surprise. M. Grégoire, when he heard that the strike had at last broken out, shrugged his shoulders in his placid way. "Bah! it would be nothing. The people were honest. With a movement of her chin, Madame Grégoire approved his confidence in the everlasting resignation of the colliers; while Cécile, who was very cheerful that day, feeling that she looked well in her capuchin cloth costume, smiled at the word "strike," which reminded her of visits to the settlements and the distribution of charities. Madame Hennebeau now appeared in black silk, followed by Négrel. "Ah, isn't it annoying?" she said at the door. "As if they couldn't wait, those men! You know that Paul refuses to take us to Saint Thomas?" "We can stay here," said Monsieur Grégoire obligingly. "We shall be quite pleased." Paul had contented himself with formally saluting Cécile and her mother. Angry at this lack of demonstrativeness, his aunt sent him with a look to the young girl, and when she heard them laughing together she enveloped them in a maternal glance. M. Hennebeau, however, finished reading his dispatches and prepared a few replies. They talked near him. The wife explained that she had not done anything to this study, which, in fact, retained its faded old red paper, its heavy mahogany furniture, its cardboard files, scratched by use. Three quarters of an hour passed, and they were about to seat themselves at table when the footman announced Monsieur Deneulin. He entered in an excited way and bowed to Madame Hennebeau. "Ah, you here!" he said, seeing the Grégoires. And he quickly spoke to the manager. "It has come, then? I've just heard of it through my engineer. With me, all the men went down this morning. But the thing may spread. I'm not at all at ease. How is it with you?" He had arrived on horseback, and his anxiety betrayed itself in his loud speech and abrupt gestures, which made him resemble a retired cavalry officer. M. Hennebeau was beginning to inform him regarding the precise situation when Hippolyte opened the dining room door. Then he interrupted himself to say: "Lunch with us. I will tell you more at dessert." "Yes, as you please," replied Deneulin, so full of his thoughts that he accepted without ceremony. He was, however, conscious of his impoliteness, and turned towards Madame Hennebeau with apologies. She was very charming, however. When she had had a seventh plate laid, she placed her guests, Madame Grégoire and Cécile by her husband, then Monsieur Grégoire and Deneulin at her own right and left, then Paul, whom she put between the young girl and her father. As they attacked the hors d'oeuvres, she said, with a smile: "You must excuse me. I wanted to give you oysters. On Monday, you know, there was an arrival of Ostend oysters at Marchiennes, and I meant to send the cook with the carriage, but she was afraid of being stoned." They all interrupted her with a great burst of gaiety. They thought the story very funny. "Hush!" said M. Hennebeau, vexed, looking at the window, through which the road could be seen. "We need not tell the whole country that we have company this morning." "Well, here is a slice of sausage which they shan't have," Monsieur Grégoire declared. The laughter began again, but with greater restraint. Each guest made himself comfortable in this room upholstered with Flemish tapestry, and furnished with old oak chests. The silver shone behind the panes of the sideboards, and there was a large hanging lamp of red copper, whose polished surfaces reflected a palm and an aspidistra growing in majolica pots. Outside, the December day was frozen by a keen northeast wind, but not a breath of it entered. A greenhouse warmth developed the delicate odour of the pineapple sliced in a crystal bowl. "Suppose we were to draw the curtains," proposed Négrel, who was amused at the idea of frightening the Grégoires. The housemaid, who was helping the footman, treated this as an order, and went and closed one of the curtains. This led to interminable jokes. Not a glass or a plate could be put down without precaution. Every dish was hailed as a waif escaped from the pillage in a conquered town. And behind this forced gaiety there was a certain fear which betrayed itself in involuntary glances towards the road, as though a band of starvelings were watching the table from outside. After the scrambled eggs with truffles, trout came on. The conversation then turned to the industrial crisis. which had become aggravated during the last 18 months. "It was inevitable," said Deneulin. "The excessive prosperity of recent years was bound to bring us to it. Think of the enormous capital which has been sunk, the railways, harbours, and canals, all the money buried in the maddest speculations. Among us alone, sugar works have been set up as if the department could furnish 3 beetroot harvests. Good heavens! And to day money is scarce, and we have to wait to catch up the interests of the expended millions. So there is a mortal congestion and a final stagnation of business." M. Hennebeau disputed this theory, but he agreed that the fortunate years had spoilt the men. "When I think," he exclaimed, "that these chaps in our pits used to gain 6 francs a day, double what they gain now, and they lived well, too, and acquired luxurious tastes. To day, naturally, it seems hard to them to go back to their old frugality." "Monsieur Grégoire," interrupted Madame Hennebeau, "let me persuade you. A little more trout. They are delicious, are they not?" The manager went on. "But, as a matter of fact, is it our fault? We too are cruelly struck. Since the factories have closed one by one, we have had a deuce of a difficulty in getting rid of our stock. And in face of the growing reduction in demand, we have been forced to lower our net prices. It is just this that the men won't understand." There was silence. The footman presented roast partridge, while the housemaid began to pour out chamotine for the guests. "There has been a famine in India," said Deneulin, in a low voice, as though he were speaking to himself. "America, by ceasing to order iron, has struck a heavy blow at our furnaces. Everything holds together. A distant shock is enough to disturb the world, and the empire, which was so proud of this hot fever of industry." He attacked his partridge wing. Then, raising his voice: "The worst is that to lower the net prices we ought logically to produce more. Otherwise the reduction bears on wages, and the worker is right in saying that he has to pay the damage." This confession, the outcome of his frankness, raised a discussion. The ladies were not at all interested. Besides, all were occupied with their plates, in the first zest of appetite. When the footman came back he seemed about to speak. Then he hesitated. "What is it?" asked M. Hennebeau. "If there are letters, give them to me. I am expecting replies." "No, sir. It is Monsieur Dansaert, who is in the hall, but he doesn't wish to disturb you." The manager excused himself and had the head captain brought in. The latter stood upright, a few paces from the table, while all turned to look at him, huge, out of breath with the news he was bringing. The settlements were quiet, only it had now been decided to send a deputation. It would, perhaps, be there in a few minutes. "Very well, thank you," said M. Hennebeau. "I want a report morning and evening, you understand." And as soon as Dansaert had gone, they began to joke again, and hastened to attack the Russian salad, declaring that not a moment was to be lost if they wished to finish it. The mirth was unbounded when Négrel, having asked the housemaid for bread, she replied, "Yes, sir," in a voice as low and terrified as if she had behind her a troop ready for murder and rape. "You may speak," said Madame Hennebeau complacently. "They are not here yet." The manager, who now received a packet of letters and dispatches, wished to read one of his letters aloud. It was from Pierron, who in respectful phrases gave notice that he was obliged to go out on strike with his comrades in order to avoid ill treatment, and he added that he had not even been able to avoid taking part in the deputation, although he blamed that step. "So much for liberty of work!" exclaimed M. Hennebeau. Then they returned to the strike, and asked him his opinion. "Oh," he replied, "we have had them before. It will be a week, or at most a fortnight, of idleness, as it was last time. They will go and wallow in the public houses, and then, when they are hungry, they will go back to the pits." Deneulin shook his head. "I'm not so satisfied. This time they appear to be better organized. Have they not a provident fund?" "Yes, scarcely 3,000 francs. What do you think they can do with that? I suspect a man called Étienne Lantier of being their leader. He is a good workman. It would vex me to have to give him his certificate back, as we did of old to the famous Rasseneur, who still poisons the Voreux with his ideas and his beer. No matter, in a week half the men will have gone down, and in a fortnight the 10,000 will be below." He was convinced. His only anxiety was concerning his own possible disgrace should the directors put the responsibility of the strike on him. For some time he had felt that he was diminishing in favour. So leaving the spoonful of Russian salad which he had taken, he read over again the dispatches received from Paris, endeavouring to penetrate every word. His guests excused him. The meal was becoming a military lunch, eaten on the field of battle before the first shots were fired. The ladies then joined in the conversation. Madame Grégoire expressed pity for the poor people who would suffer from hunger, and Cécile was already making plans for distributing gifts of bread and meat. But Madame Hennebeau was astonished at hearing of the wretchedness of the Montsou colliers. Were they not very fortunate? People who were lodged and warmed and cared for at the expense of the Company. In her indifference for the herd she only knew the lessons she had learnt, and with which she had surprised the Parisians who came on a visit. She believed them at last, and was indignant at the ingratitude of the people. Négrel, meanwhile, continued to frighten Monsieur Grégoire. Cécile did not displease him, and he was quite willing to marry her to be agreeable to his aunt, but he showed no amorous fever, like a youth of experience who, he said, was not easily carried away now. He professed to be a republican, which did not prevent him from treating his men with extreme severity, or from making fun of them in the company of the ladies. "Nor have I my uncle's optimism either," he continued. "I fear there will be serious disturbances. So I should advise you, Monsieur Grégoire, to lock up Piolaine. They may pillage you." Just then, still retaining the smile which illuminated his good natured face, Monsieur Grégoire was going beyond his wife in paternal sentiments with regard to the miners. "Pillage me!" he cried, stupefied. "And why pillage me? Are you not a shareholder in Montsou? You do nothing, you live on the work of others. In fact, you are an infamous capitalist, and that is enough. You may be sure that if the revolution triumphs, it will force you to restore your fortune as stolen money." At once he lost his childlike tranquillity, his serene unconsciousness. He stammered: "Stolen money! My fortune! Did not my great grandfather gain, and hardly too, the sum originally invested? Have we not run all the risks of the enterprise, and do I to day make a bad use of my income?" Madame Hennebeau, alarmed at seeing the mother and daughter, also white with fear, hastened to intervene, saying: "Paul is joking, my dear sir." But Monsieur Grégoire was carried out of himself. As the servant was passing round the crayfish he took 3 of them, without knowing what he was doing, and began to break their claws with his teeth. Ah, I don't say but what there are shareholders who abuse their position. For instance, I have been told that ministers have received shares in Montsou for services rendered to the Company. It is like a nobleman whom I will not name, a duke, the biggest of our shareholders, whose life is a scandal of prodigality, millions thrown into the street on women, feasting, and useless luxury. But we who live quietly, like good citizens as we are, who do not speculate, who are content to live wholesomely on what we have, giving a part to the poor. Come now, your men must be mere brigands if they came and stole a pin from us." Négrel himself had to calm him, though amused at his anger. The crayfish were still going round. The little crackling sound of their carapaces could be heard, while the conversation turned to politics. Monsieur Grégoire, in spite of everything, and though still trembling, called himself a Liberal, and regretted Louis Philippe. As for Deneulin, he was for a strong government. He declared that the Emperor was gliding down the slope of dangerous concessions. "Remember '89," he said. "It was the nobility who made the Revolution possible by their complicity and taste for philosophic novelties. Very well. The middle class to day are playing the same silly game with their furious liberalism, their rage for destruction, their flattery of the people. Yes, yes, you are sharpening the teeth of the monster that will devour us. It will devour us, rest assured." The ladies bade him be silent, and tried to change the conversation by asking him news of his daughters. Lucie was at Marchiennes, where she was singing with a friend. Jean was painting an old beggar's head. But he said these things in a distracted way. He constantly looked at the manager, who was absorbed in the reading of his despatches and forgetful of his guests. Behind those thin leaves he felt Paris and the directors' orders which would decide the strike. At last he could not help yielding to his preoccupation. "Well, what are you going to do?" he asked suddenly. M. Hennebeau started, then turned off the question with a vague phrase: "We shall see." "No doubt you are solidly placed. You can wait." Deneulin began to think aloud. "But as for me, I shall be done for it if the strike reaches Vandame. I shall have reinstated Jean Bart in vain. With a single pit I can only get along by constant production. Ah! I am not in a very pleasant situation, I can assure you." This involuntary confession seemed to strike M. Hennebeau. He listened, and a plan formed within him. In case the strike turned out badly, why not utilize it by letting things run down until his neighbour was ruined, and then buy up his concession at a low price? That would be the surest way of regaining the good graces of the directors, who for years had dreamed of possessing Vandame. "If Jean Bart bothers you as much as that," said he, laughing, "why don't you give it up to us?" But Deneulin was already regretting his complaints. He exclaimed: "Never! Never!" They were amused at his vigour and had already forgotten the strike by the time the dessert appeared. An apple charlotte meringue was overwhelmed with praise. Afterwards the ladies discussed a recipe with respect to the pineapple which was declared equally exquisite. The grapes and pears completed their happy abandonment at the end of this copious lunch. All talked excitedly at the same time, while the servant poured out Rhine wine in place of champagne, which was looked upon as commonplace. And the marriage of Paul and Cécile certainly made a forward step in the sympathy produced by the dessert. His aunt had thrown such urgent looks in his direction that the young man showed himself very amiable, and in his wheedling way reconquered the Grégoires, who had been cast down by his stories of pillage. For a moment M. Hennebeau, seeing the close understanding between his wife and his nephew, felt that abominable suspicion again revive, as if in this exchange of looks he had surprised a physical contact. But again the idea of the marriage, made here before his face, reassured him. Hippolyte was serving the coffee when the housemaid entered in a fright. "Sir, sir, they are here!" It was the delegates. Doors banged, a breath of terror was passing through the neighbouring rooms. Around the table the guests were looking at one another with uneasy indecision. There was silence. Then they tried to resume their jokes. They pretended to put the rest of the sugar in their pockets, and talked of hiding the plate. But the manager remained grave, and the laughter fell and their voices sank to a whisper, while the heavy feet of the delegates who were being shown in tramped over the carpet of the next room. Madame Hennebeau said to her husband, lowering her voice: "I hope you will drink your coffee?" "Certainly," he replied. "Let them wait." He was nervous, listening to every sound, though apparently occupied with his cup. Paul and Cécile got up, and he made her venture an eye to the keyhole. They were stifling their laughter and talking in a low voice. "Do you see them?" "Yes, I see a big man and two small ones behind." "Haven't they ugly faces?" "Not at all. They are very nice." Suddenly M. Hennebeau left his chair, saying the coffee was too hot and he would drink it afterwards. As he went out he put a finger to his lips to recommend prudence. They all sat down again and remained at table in silence, no longer daring to move, listening from afar with intent ears jarred by these coarse male voices. End of Section 17. Section 18 of Germinal by Émile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Part 4. Chapter 2. The previous day, at a meeting held at Rasseneur's, Étienne and some comrades had chosen the delegates who were to proceed on the following day to the manager's house. When, in the evening, Maheude learned that her man was one of them, she was in despair, and asked him if he wanted them to be thrown on the street. Maheu himself had agreed with reluctance. Both of them, when the moment of action came, in spite of the injustice of their wretchedness, fell back on the resignation of their race, trembling before the morrow, preferring still to bend their backs to the yoke. In the management of affairs he usually gave way to his wife, whose advice was sound. This time, however, he grew angry at last, all the more so since he secretly shared her fears. "Just leave me alone, will you?" he said, going to bed and turning his back. "A fine thing to leave the mates now. I'm doing my duty." She went to bed in her turn. Neither of them spoke. Then, after a long silence, she replied: "You're right. Go. Only, poor old man, we are done for." Midday struck while they were at lunch, for the rendezvous was at 1 o'clock at the Avantage, from which they were to go together to M. Hennebeau's. They were eating potatoes. As there was only a small morsel of butter left, no one touched it. They would have bread and butter in the evening. "You know that we reckon on you to speak," said Étienne suddenly to Maheu. The latter was so overcome that he was silent from emotion. "No, no! That's too much!" cried Maheude. "I'm quite willing he should go there, but I don't allow him to go at the head." "Why him, more than any one else?" Then Étienne, with his fiery eloquence, began to explain. Maheu was the best worker in the pit, the most liked and the most respected, whose good sense was always spoken of. In his mouth the miners' claims would carry decisive weight. At first Étienne had arranged to speak, but he had been at Montsou for too short a time. One who belonged to the country would be better listened to. In fact, the comrades were confiding their interests to the most worthy. He could not refuse, it would be cowardly. Maheude made a gesture of despair. "Go, go, my man! Go and be killed for the others. I'm willing after all." "But I could never do it," stammered Maheu. "I should say something stupid." Étienne, glad to have persuaded him, struck him on the shoulder. "Say what you feel, and you won't go wrong." Father Bonnemort, whose legs were now less swollen, was listening with his mouth full, shaking his head. There was silence. When potatoes were being eaten, the children were subdued and behaved well. Then, having swallowed his mouthful, the old man muttered slowly: "You can say what you like, and it will be all the same as if you said nothing. Ah, I've seen these affairs, I've seen them. 40 years ago they drove us out of the manager's house, and with sabres too. Now they may receive you, perhaps, but they won't answer you any more than that wall. Lord, they have money, why should they care?" There was silence again. Maheu and Étienne rose, and left the family in gloom before the empty plates. On going out they called for Pierron and Levaque, and then all four went to Rasseneur's, where the delegates from the neighbouring settlements were arriving in little groups. When the 20 members of the deputation had assembled there, they settled on the terms to be opposed to the companies, and then set out for Montsou. The keen northeast wind was sweeping the street. As they arrived, it struck 2. At first the servant told them to wait, and shut the door on them. Then, when he came back, he introduced them into the drawing room and opened the curtains. A soft daylight entered, sifted through the lace, and the miners, when left alone, in their embarrassment, did not care to sit, all of them very clean, dressed in cloth, shaven that morning, with their yellow hair and moustaches. They twisted their caps between their fingers and looked sideways at the furniture, which was in every variety of style, as a result of the taste for the old fashioned. Henry II easy chairs, Louis XV chairs, an Italian cabinet of the 17th century, a Spanish contador of the 15th century, with an altar front serving as a chimney piece, and ancient chasuble trimming reapplied to the curtains. This old gold and these old silks with their tawny tones, all this luxurious church furniture, had overwhelmed them with respectful discomfort. The Eastern carpets with their long wool seemed to bind their feet. But what especially suffocated them was the heat like that of a hot air stove, which surprised them as they felt it with cheeks frozen from the wind of the road. 5 minutes passed by, and their awkwardness increased in the comfort of this rich room, so pleasantly warm. At last M. Hennebeau entered, buttoned up in a military manner and wearing on his frock coat the correct little bow of his decoration. He spoke first. "Ah, here you are! You are in rebellion, it seems." He interrupted himself to add, with polite stiffness: "Sit down. I desire nothing better than to talk things over." The miners turned round, looking for seats. A few of them ventured to place themselves in chairs, while the others, disturbed by the embroidered silks, preferred to remain standing. There was a period of silence. M. Hennebeau, who had drawn his easy chair up to the fireplace, was rapidly looking them over and endeavouring to recall their faces. He had recognized Pierron, who was hidden in the last row, and his eyes rested on Étienne, who was seated in front of him. "Well," he asked, "what have you to say to me?" He had expected to hear the young man speak, and he was so surprised to see Maheu come forward that he could not avoid adding: "What! You, a good workman who have always been so sensible, one of the old Montsou people whose family has worked in the mine since the first stroke of the axe? Ah, it's a pity! I'm sorry that you are at the head of the discontented." Maheude listened with his eyes down. Then he began, at first in a low and hesitating voice: "It is just because I am a quiet man, sir, whom no one has anything against, that my mates have chosen me, that ought to show you that it isn't just a rebellion of blusterers, badly disposed men who want to create disorder. We only want justice, we are tired of starving, and it seems to us that the time has come when things ought to be arranged so that we can at least have bread every day." His voice grew stronger. He lifted his eyes and went on, while looking at the manager: "You know quite well that we cannot agree to your new system. They accuse us of bad timbering. It's true we don't give the necessary time to the work, but if we gave it, our day's work would be still smaller, and as it doesn't give us enough food at present, that would mean the end of everything, the sweep of the clout that would wipe off all your men. Pay us more, and we will timber better. We will give the necessary hours to the timbering instead of putting all our strength into the picking, which is the only work that pays. There's no other arrangement possible. If the work is to be done it must be paid for. And what have you invented instead? A thing which we can't get into our heads, don't you see? You lower the price of the tram, and then you pretend to make up for it by paying for all timbering separately. If that was true, we should be robbed all the same, for the timbering would still take us more time. But what makes us mad is that it isn't even true. The Company compensates for nothing at all. It simply puts 2 centimes a tram into its pocket, that's all." "Yes, yes, that's it," murmured the other deputies, noticing M. Hennebeau make a violent movement as if to interrupt. But Maheu cut the manager short. Now that he had set out, his words came by themselves. At times he listened to himself with surprise, as though a stranger were speaking within him. It was the things amassed within his breast, things he did not even know were there, and which came out in an expansion of his heart. He described the wretchedness that was common to all of them, the hard toil, the brutal life, the wife and little ones crying from hunger in the house. He quoted the recent disastrous payments, the absurd fortnightly wages eaten up by fines and rest days and brought back to their families in tears. Was it resolved to destroy them? "Then, sir," he concluded, "we have come to tell you that if we've got to starve, we would rather starve doing nothing. It will be a little less trouble. We have left the pits and we don't go down again unless the Company agrees to our terms. The Company wants to lower the price of the tram and to pay for the timbering separately. We ask for things to be left as they were, and we also ask for 5 centimes more the tram. Now it is for you to see if you are on the side of justice and work." Voices rose among the miners. "That's it. He has said what we all feel. We only ask what's reason." Others, without speaking, showed their approval by nodding their heads. The luxurious room had disappeared, with its gold and its embroideries, its mysterious piling up of ancient things, and they no longer even felt the carpet which they crushed beneath their heavy boots. "Let me reply, then," at last exclaimed M. Hennebeau, who was growing angry. "First of all, it is not true that the Company gains 2 centimes the tram. Let us look at the figures." A confused discussion followed. The manager, trying to divide them, appealed to Pierron, who hid himself, stammering. Levaque, on the contrary, was at the head of the more aggressive, muddling up things and affirming facts of which he was ignorant. The loud murmurs of their voices were stifled beneath the hangings in this hothouse atmosphere. "If you all talk at the same time," said M. Hennebeau, "we shall never come to an understanding." He had regained his calmness, the rough politeness, without bitterness, of an agent who has received his instructions and means that they shall be respected. From the first word he never took his eye off Étienne, and manoeuvred to draw the young man out of his obstinate silence. Leaving the discussion about the 2 centimes, he suddenly enlarged the question. "No, acknowledge the truth, you are yielding to abominable incitations. It is a plague which is now blowing over the workers everywhere, and corrupting the best. Oh! I have no need for any one to confess. I can see well that you have been changed. You who used to be so quiet. Is it not so? You have been promised more butter than bread, and you have been told that now your turn has come to be masters. In fact, you have been enrolled in that famous International, that army of brigands who dream of destroying society." Then Étienne interrupted him. "You are mistaken, sir. Not a single Montsou collier has yet enrolled. But if they are driven to it, all the pits will enroll themselves. That depends on the Company." From that moment the struggle went on between M. Hennebeau and Étienne as though the other miners were no longer there. "The Company is a providence for the men, and you are wrong to threaten it. This year it has spent 300,000 francs in building settlements which only return 2%, and I say nothing of the pensions which it pays, nor of the coals and medicines which it gives. You who seem to be intelligent, and who have become in a few months one of our most skilful workmen, would it not be better if you were to spread these truths, rather than ruin yourself by associating with people of bad reputation? Yes, I mean Rasseneur, whom we had to turn off in order to save our pits from socialistic corruption. You are constantly seen with him, and it is certainly he who has induced you to form this Provident Fund, which we would willingly tolerate if it were merely a means of saving, but which we feel to be a weapon turned against us, a reserve fund to pay the expenses of the war. And in this connection I ought to add that the Company means to control that fund." Étienne allowed him to continue, fixing his eyes on him, while a slight nervous quiver moved his lips. He smiled at the last remark, and simply replied: "Then that is a new demand. For until now, sir, you have neglected to claim that control. Unfortunately, we wish the Company to occupy itself less with us, and instead of playing the part of Providence, to be merely just with us, giving us our due, the profits which it appropriates. Is it honest, whenever a crisis comes, to leave the workers to die with hunger in order to save the shareholders' dividends? Whatever you may say, sir, the new system is a disguised reduction of wages, and that is what we are rebelling against. For if the Company wants to economize, it acts very badly by only economizing on the men." "Ah, there we are!" cried M. Hennebeau. "I was expecting that. The accusation of starving the people and living by their sweat. How can you talk such folly, you who ought to know the enormous risks which capital runs in industry, in the mines, for example? A well equipped pit to day costs from 1,500,000 francs to 2 millions, and it is difficult enough to get a moderate interest on the vast sum that is thus swallowed. Nearly half the mining companies in France are bankrupt. Besides, it is stupid to accuse those who succeed of cruelty. When their workers suffer, they suffer themselves. Can you believe that the Company has not as much to lose as you have in the present crisis? It does not govern wages, it obeys competition, under pain of ruin. Blame the facts, not the Company. But you don't wish to hear, you don't wish to understand." "Yes," said the young man, "we understand very well that our lot will never be bettered as long as things go on as they are going, and that is the reason why some day or another the workers will end by arranging that things shall go differently." This sentence, so moderate in form, was pronounced in a low voice, but with such conviction, tremulous in its menace, that a deep silence followed. A certain constraint, a breath of fear passed through the polite drawing room. The other delegates, though scarcely understanding, felt that their comrade had been demanding their share of this comfort, and they began to cast sidelong looks over the warm hangings, the comfortable seats, all this luxury of which the least knick-knack would have bought them soup for a month. At last M. Hennebeau, who had remained thoughtful, rose as a sign for them to depart. All imitated him. Étienne had lightly pushed Maheu's elbow, and the latter, his tongue once more thick and awkward, again spoke. "Then, sir, that is all that you reply? We must tell the others that you reject our terms." "I, my good fellow," exclaimed the manager, "I reject nothing. I am paid just as you are. I have no more power in the matter than the smallest of your trammers. I receive my orders, and my only duty is to see that they are executed. I have told you what I thought I ought to tell you, but it is not for me to decide. You have brought me your demands. I will make them known to the directors. Then I will tell you their reply." He spoke with the correct air of a high official avoiding any passionate interest in the matter, with the courteous dryness of a simple instrument of authority. And the miners now looked at him with distrust, asking themselves what interest he might have in lying, and what he would get by thus putting himself between them and the real masters. A schemer, perhaps, this man, who was paid like a worker, and who lived so well. Étienne ventured to intervene again. "You see, sir, how unfortunate it is that we cannot plead our cause in person. We could explain many things, and bring forward many reasons of which you could know nothing, if we only knew where we ought to go." M. Hennebeau was not at all angry, he even smiled. "Ah, it gets complicated as soon as you have no confidence in me. You will have to go over there." The delegates had followed the vague gesture of his hand toward one of the windows. Where was it, over there? Paris, no doubt, but they did not know exactly. It seemed to fall back into a terrible distance, in an inaccessible religious country, where an unknown god sat on his throne, crouching down at the far end of his tabernacle. They would never see him, they only felt him as a force far off, which weighed on the 10,000 colliers of Montsou. And when the director spoke, he had that hidden force behind him delivering oracles. They were overwhelmed with discouragement. Étienne himself signified by a shrug of the shoulders that it would be best to go, while M. Hennebeau touched Maheu's arm in a friendly way and asked after Jeanlin. "That is a severe lesson now, and it is you who defend bad timbering. You must reflect, my friends. You must realize that a strike would be a disaster for everybody. Before a week you would die of hunger. What would you do? I count on your good sense anyhow, and I am convinced that you will go down on Monday at the latest." They all left, going out of the drawing room with the tramping of a flock and rounded backs, without replying a word to this hope of submission. The manager, who accompanied them, was obliged to continue the conversation. The Company, on the one side, had its new tariff; the workers, on the other, their demand for an increase of 5 centimes the tram. In order that they might have no illusions, he felt he ought to warn them that their terms would certainly be rejected by the directors. "Reflect before committing any follies," he repeated, disturbed at their silence. In the porch Pierron bowed very low, while Levaque pretended to adjust his cap. Maheu was trying to find something to say before leaving, when Étienne again touched his elbow, and they all left in the midst of this threatening silence. The door closed with a loud bang. When M. Hennebeau re entered the dining room, he found his guests motionless and silent before the liqueurs. In 2 words he told his story to Deneulin, whose face grew still more gloomy. Then, as he drank his cold coffee, they tried to speak of other things. But the Grégoires themselves returned to the subject of the strike, expressing their astonishment that no laws existed to prevent workmen from leaving their work. Paul reassured Cécile, stating that they were expecting the police. At last Madame Hennebeau called the servant. "Hippolyte, before we go into the drawing room, just open the windows and let in a little air." Section 19.